What if the most dangerous royal move wasn't announced with trumpets, but discovered in silence? What if, 5 minutes ago, someone at the very top of the monarchy realized that a long-dismissed idea wasn't dead at all, but quietly evolving? And what if the person who discovered it didn't panic, didn't shout, didn't leak, but instead did something far more unsettling? Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. This is not a story about love. It's not even a story about family. It's a story about power, about timing, about ambition versus institution. And according to swirling reports, private whispers, and strategic analysis that refuses to go away, it's a story that may have landed directly on the desk of Prince William at the worst possible moment. Ask yourself something. If a plan had failed once, publicly, spectacularly, would you abandon it forever? Or would you wait? Wait until the noise died down. Wait until public memory softened. Wait until circumstances shifted just enough that the same idea could be repackaged, rebranded, and reintroduced under a completely different emotional wrapper. That question sits at the heart of today's story. Because for years, the prevailing assumption has been simple. The door was closed. The bridge was burned. The chapter was over. Yet suddenly, very suddenly, there are whispers that suggest otherwise. Not loud announcements, not official statements, but soft signals, strategic timing, carefully placed narratives, and an alleged idea that refuses to stay buried. A return to the UK, not as a retreat, but as a repositioning. And according to commentators and royal watchers, the plan, if it exists, was never about apologizing. It was about ascending. Now let's be clear before we go any further. What you're about to hear is not a declaration of fact. It is an analysis of alleged strategies, reported whispers, and hypothetical power dynamics discussed by insiders, commentators, and media analysts. No one is claiming a formal announcement exists. But here's the thing. The royal machine doesn't move in public first. It moves in private. And that's why this matters. Because when institutions sense a possible disruption, especially one involving succession, legitimacy, and public perception, they don't wait for confirmation. They prepare. And allegedly, that preparation began the moment a certain impossible idea began circulating again. An idea linked, once more, to Meghan Markle. Now pause here. Ask yourself this. Why now? Why after years of distance? Why after public declarations of independence? Why after lawsuits, documentaries, interviews, books, and burned trust? Why would the idea of returning, physically, symbolically, or narratively, resurface at all? Unless the goal had changed. Because this time, according to those dissecting the situation, the alleged approach isn't emotional. It's strategic. Not let me back in, but something far more complex. Something closer to, let me be seen again on different terms. This is where the story stops being personal and starts becoming structural. Because the monarchy doesn't run on feelings. It runs on optics, hierarchy, continuity, and most importantly, control of narrative. Every royal role exists within a delicate balance. Every appearance reinforces an order. Every absence creates space. And space is dangerous, especially when filled by speculation. Now consider Prince William's position. He isn't just a family member reacting to old wounds. He's the future custodian of an institution that survives by eliminating uncertainty. And uncertainty is exactly what this alleged plan threatened to introduce. Think about it. A rumored return, even without titles, even without duties, would ignite questions. What role? What access? What influence? What trajectory? And perhaps the most destabilizing question of all. Why now? According to analysts, that's when the mood reportedly shifted. Because timing is never accidental. Public sentiment is cyclical. Media fatigue fades. Sympathy can be rebuilt. And history has shown us something uncomfortable. Public memory is short. Institutions know this. Strategists know this. Which is why the most effective power plays aren't rushed. They're delayed. Now imagine Prince William receiving a briefing. Not dramatic. Not explosive. Just information. Fragments. Patterns. Signals. Stories testing the water. Narratives softening the edges. Speculation framed as curiosity rather than demand. Not a demand to return. A suggestion that returning might be reasonable, that it might even be healing, that it might benefit the monarchy itself. And that's where the alarm bells allegedly rang. Because when something is framed as beneficial to the institution, you have to ask, beneficial to whom? This is the moment the story changes tone. Because from this point forward, the alleged response wasn't emotional. It was analytical. Royal observers often underestimate Prince William by projecting temperament instead of training. But those who've studied royal transitions will tell you something critical. Future kings are taught one thing above all else. Never react publicly to a private threat. You absorb. You assess. You neutralize. Silently. And according to reports, that's exactly what happened next. No public statement. No denial. No acknowledgement. Just a tightening of structure. Because here's the contradiction at the center of this alleged plan. To rise within an institution, you must accept its rules. But to reshape it, you must challenge them. You cannot do both openly. And the monarchy is particularly sensitive to one thing. Ambiguity of power. Not rebellion. Not criticism. Ambiguity. A figure who exists in the system but not of it. Visible but undefined. Present but not accountable. History shows us that those figures cause the most instability. So when whispers of a return allegedly began aligning with narratives of influence, relevance, and long-term positioning, analysts suggest Prince William recognized something instantly. This wasn't about going back. It was about moving forward. Through the institution, not around it. And that, according to royal logic, changes everything. Because the monarchy can tolerate criticism. It can survive distance. But it cannot function with competing centers of symbolic authority, especially not near the line of succession. This is why William's alleged response is described by insiders not as dramatic, but deliberate, because power doesn't need to shout when it can simply hold the door closed. And yet, the most fascinating part of this story isn't the alleged plan itself. It's what happens when a strategy designed for public consumption runs into institutional memory. The monarchy remembers everything. It remembers patterns, precedents, outcomes, and it remembers how similar attempts ended in the past. So when this new narrative began circulating, softly, carefully, almost innocently, it wasn't met with outrage. It was met with containment. And containment is far more effective. Now ask yourself this. If Prince William truly believed that a rumored plan, real or imagined, had the potential to destabilize future authority, would he wait? Or would he act before the public ever knew there was something to react to? According to those watching closely, he chose the latter, but not in the way anyone expected. Because what came next wasn't a confrontation. It wasn't a leak. It wasn't a warning shot. It was a move so quiet that most people missed it entirely. And that's where our story is headed next. Because once you understand what allegedly happened behind the scenes, how the chessboard shifted, how narratives were boxed in, how options quietly disappeared, you begin to see why some insiders say the plan never stood a chance. Not because it was impossible, but because it was anticipated. And anticipation is the monarchy's greatest weapon. But what exactly did Prince William do? Who did he involve? And why did this alleged strategy begin unraveling before it ever reached the public stage? That answer takes us deeper, past the whispers, past the speculation, into the silent mechanics of royal power. And once you see that machinery at work, you'll understand why this story is only just beginning. Because what came next would change everything. And no one saw it coming. What if the most dangerous idea in the monarchy didn't arrive with headlines, but with a pause? A pause in briefings. A pause in tone. A pause so subtle that only people trained to read silence would notice. Because this story didn't begin with a leak. It began with a whisper. And whispers, inside royal systems, are never random. They move along corridors, across desks, between aides who never put things in writing. And according to royal commentators and analysts, this particular whisper carried a word no one expected to hear again. Return. Not an announcement. Not a demand. Not even a denial. Just the quiet reappearance of a possibility many believed had been permanently closed. Ask yourself something. When an idea refuses to die, is it because it was unfinished? Or because it was waiting for the right conditions? Because those conditions, according to observers, may have finally aligned. The timing alone raised eyebrows. No official milestone. No crisis forcing reconciliation. No public apology tour. Just a shift. Stories framed differently. Language softened. Speculation presented as curiosity rather than challenge. And that's how whispers work. They don't tell you what is happening. They test whether you're ready to believe it could. Now here's the contradiction. If the idea of returning to the UK was truly impossible, why did it need to be tested at all? Why float it? Why reintroduce it into conversation spaces where it had been absent for years? Unless the goal wasn't approval. Unless the goal was calibration. Because the most effective strategies don't ask permission. They measure resistance. And according to those watching the media landscape closely, that's exactly what began to happen. Small questions appeared. Hypotheticals. What if conversations? Not demands. Just feelers. And every feeler has a destination. In this case, the destination was the royal machine itself. Now think about Prince William's role for a moment. Not as a brother. Not as a son. But as the man who will inherit an institution designed to outlive sentiment. He is trained to notice patterns. Trained to identify early signals. Trained to understand that public narratives are often the final stage of a private process. So when analysts suggest that something reached him, they don't mean a phone call. They mean alignment. Alignment between media tone, timing, and narrative framing. Alignment is the real alert system. And when alignment occurs around a previously volatile subject, it demands attention. Because the monarchy doesn't react to noise. It reacts to trajectories. Ask yourself this. What trajectory would a return create? Not tomorrow. Not next week. But 5 years from now. 10. Would it clarify roles? Or blur them? Would it strengthen hierarchy? Or introduce ambiguity? And ambiguity, inside royal structures, is the one thing that cannot be tolerated. That's why this whisper mattered. Because it wasn't loud enough to confront, but it was persistent enough to track. Observers noted that the language began to change. Not openly supportive, but less absolute. Words like never quietly disappeared. Words like unlikely took their place. That may sound insignificant. It isn't. Language shifts are the first sign of strategic repositioning. Now consider the figure at the center of the speculation, Meghan Markle. For years, the narrative was binary. In or out. Royal or independent. But binary stories don't age well. They invite reassessment. And reassessment is fertile ground for reframing. According to commentators, the new framing wasn't emotional. It wasn't about regret. It was about evolution, growth, perspective, the passage of time. These are powerful tools because they don't contradict the past. They reinterpret it. And reinterpretation is far more effective than denial. Now imagine how that reinterpretation looks from inside the palace. A narrative that says, I didn't fail. I moved on. And now, I might return. Not as before, but as something new. Something undefined. Something flexible. That's where the whisper becomes dangerous. Because undefined roles create undefined expectations. And undefined expectations destabilize systems built on clarity. Royal analysts point out that this is where Prince William's attention would have sharpened. Not because of fear, but because of responsibility. Because every future monarch understands one thing. You don't wait for a crisis to manage it. You prevent it from forming. And prevention rarely looks dramatic. It looks boring. It looks procedural. It looks like nothing happened at all, which is why the public saw nothing. But behind the scenes, observers suggest the palace began asking questions. Quiet ones. What exactly is being tested? Who benefits from this narrative shift? What assumptions are being reintroduced? And most importantly, what happens if the public starts imagining a role that doesn't exist? Because once imagination takes hold, containment becomes harder. That's why whispers matter. They're the rehearsal stage of perception. Now let's talk about timing again. Why now? Royal watchers have offered theories. Some point to public fatigue, others to generational shifts, others to a belief that enough time has passed to soften edges. But the most compelling explanation focuses on succession. Transitions create vulnerability, not weakness, uncertainty. And uncertainty invites speculation. The closer Prince William moves toward kingship, the more every narrative around him matters. Not just who he is, but who exists near him. Visibility equals relevance. And relevance, inside the monarchy, is tightly controlled. So when whispers of return begin circulating during a period of heightened focus on the future of the crown, it raises a red flag. Not a crisis, a calculation. Because institutions don't fear individuals. They fear unpredictability. And unpredictability often hides inside reasonable ideas. A quiet return. A symbolic presence. An undefined role. Reasonable until it isn't. Now imagine Prince William receiving a briefing. Not sensational, just measured. A summary of trends, media shifts, public curiosity, narrative testing, and a simple conclusion. This idea is being floated, not loudly, but deliberately. That's when strategy replaces emotion. Because the future king's job isn't to argue. It's to decide what paths must never open. And according to analysts, one path stood out. A scenario where symbolic presence creates perceived leverage, where ambiguity invites interpretation, where interpretation becomes pressure, and pressure becomes expectation. That's the domino chain. And the first domino is always narrative. So what did William do? Not what people expect. He didn't react. He didn't deny. He didn't escalate. He waited. Because waiting reveals intent. Those testing narratives often grow bolder if unchallenged, or they retreat if resistance is felt indirectly. And indirect resistance is the most effective kind. This is where the story becomes counterintuitive. Because the alleged response wasn't a block. It was a reframing. Instead of confronting the whisper, the institution reinforced clarity elsewhere. More emphasis on continuity. More focus on defined roles. More visible stability. Not as a rebuttal, but as a contrast. Contrast is powerful because it forces the public to choose between certainty and speculation. And people almost always choose certainty. Now ask yourself this. If a narrative quietly disappears without ever being challenged, did it fail? Or was it neutralized before it could mature? That question sits at the heart of this chapter. Because what followed the whisper wasn't escalation. It was silence, but not empty silence. Structured silence. And structured silence is never accidental. Observers noted something else. The whispers didn't grow louder. They stalled. Stories didn't advance. Questions weren't answered. Momentum faded. And momentum is everything. Which suggests that something, or someone, removed the oxygen. Not publicly, but systemically. That's how institutions win. They don't fight. They outlast. And that brings us back to Prince William. Because his greatest advantage isn't authority. It's patience. He doesn't need to win today. He needs to ensure stability tomorrow, and the day after that. So when analysts say his response was unbelievable, they don't mean shocking. They mean understated. The kind of move that looks like nothing, until you realize it changed the entire board. And here's the twist. The whisper that started all of this didn't expose ambition. It exposed something more dangerous. Misalignment. Between narrative ambition and institutional reality. Because the monarchy isn't moved by intention, it's moved by structure. And structure, once reinforced, leaves very little room to maneuver. Which is why, according to those watching closely, the plan, if it existed, began unraveling before it ever reached the public stage. Not because it was attacked, but because it was anticipated. And anticipation is a wall you don't see until you walk into it. But this is only the beginning. Because once the whisper was contained, something else happened. Something quieter. Something more decisive. A realization that this wasn't a one-off idea, but part of a broader strategy. And that realization triggered a response not just from Prince William, but from the palace ecosystem itself. Because when one whisper fails, strategists don't stop. They adapt. And adaptation is where this story truly deepens. Because the next move didn't come from the media. It came from inside the chessboard. And once you see how that board is set, you'll understand why the next phase of this story was inevitable. What if the most revealing part of a plan isn't what it demands, but what it avoids saying out loud? Because after the whisper stalled, something else became visible to those who know how to look. Not a push, a posture, not confrontation, presentation. And that's where this story pivots, from rumor to design. Ask yourself a simple question. When a strategy truly wants permission, it asks. When it wants leverage, it reframes. According to analysts, what emerged after the initial whisper wasn't an insistence on return, it was a recalibration of image. A softening, a smoothing of edges, a smile that didn't ask to be trusted, but suggested it might be reasonable to try. That smile is where the alleged strategy lives. Because power doesn't always announce itself with demands. Sometimes it arrives dressed as growth. Growth is persuasive. Growth disarms. Growth implies maturity without requiring accountability. And accountability, inside royal structures, is everything. Now pause here. Think about how narratives are built. They don't start with conclusions. They start with feelings. And feelings, when curated carefully, can override memory. This is where commentators suggest the alleged plan took shape, not as a blueprint, but as a mood. A mood that said, time has passed. A mood that said, people change. A mood that said, maybe it's not so simple anymore. Notice what that mood avoids. This is the trap of strategic ambiguity. And ambiguity, as we've said, is destabilizing. But here's the contradiction. Institutions survive by clarity, not by flexibility. Flexibility is for individuals. Institutions endure by limits. And Prince William understands this better than most. So when analysts describe his response as unbelievable, they don't mean emotional. They mean precise. Because instead of reacting to the mood, the palace reinforced the frame. Not the frame of return. The frame of order. Let's talk about that order. Royal roles are not symbolic hobbies. They are structural positions. Each one defines proximity to power, access to influence, and public perception. Remove clarity from any one of those, and the entire system wobbles. That's why the alleged strategy behind the smile was so dangerous. Not because it demanded a throne, but because it blurred the ladder. If the public can imagine a path upward, they will assume one exists. And assumptions become pressure. Pressure becomes narrative. Narrative becomes expectation. And expectation is harder to dismantle than opposition. This is where Prince William's training kicks in. Future kings are taught something counterintuitive. You don't fight narratives head-on. You starve them. And starving a narrative requires replacing it, not with denial, but with something sturdier. Certainty. Certainty doesn't argue. It reassures. And reassurance makes speculation look childish. So while some expected a statement, a denial, a dramatic rebuttal, none came. Instead, observers noticed a shift in emphasis. Less attention on the past. More emphasis on continuity. More visibility of defined roles. Not in response to rumors, but in parallel to them. Parallel moves are devastating. Because they don't acknowledge the threat. They overshadow it. Now think about the alleged plan again. If its power came from suggestion, what happens when suggestion is drowned out by structure? It withers. And that's exactly what analysts suggest began to happen. The smile remained, but the space around it shrank. The narrative lacked oxygen. But here's the twist. The strategy wasn't naive. Those allegedly behind it understood that direct paths were blocked. So the approach wasn't frontal. It was lateral. This is where observers began to notice the emphasis on public sympathy. Stories framed around resilience. Reinvention. Finding one's voice. These themes aren't new. But when reintroduced in a new context, they take on fresh meaning. Because resilience suggests survival. Reinvention suggests progress. And progress suggests direction. Direction implies movement. And movement invites speculation about destination. Now ask yourself, if the destination were irrelevant, why hint at movement at all? That's the question that reportedly sharpened Prince William's focus. Because movement without destination is narrative theater. And theater, inside royal optics, is dangerous. Why? Because theater invites applause. And applause shifts attention. Attention, in turn, creates leverage. This is where the alleged strategy reveals its true ambition, not in explicit claims, but in gravitational pull. The closer a figure appears to the center, the more the public assumes relevance. Relevance breeds authority, even if informal. And informal authority is harder to control than formal power. So the response couldn't be emotional. It had to be systemic. Which brings us to a critical moment analysts point to. A moment when the palace didn't respond to the smile, but responded to the implication behind it. By clarifying, not the future, but the present. Clear roles. Clear visibility. Clear hierarchy. No debate. No commentary. Just demonstration. Demonstration is the language institutions speak fluently. And demonstration cuts through ambiguity like a blade. Now here's where it gets interesting. Some observers argue that this response wasn't defensive. It was anticipatory. Because the palace wasn't just reacting to one narrative. It was preparing for iterations. Because when a strategy fails quietly, it doesn't disappear. It mutates. And the first mutation is always denial. This was never about return. This was about healing. This was about possibility. But denial doesn't erase trajectory. It confirms it. which is why the palace response didn't target the claim. It targeted the runway. No runway. No takeoff. And yet, there's another contradiction worth examining. If the alleged strategy was purely symbolic, why would it matter? Why would Prince William care? Because symbols become precedents, and precedents shape future negotiations, even hypothetical ones. The monarchy doesn't plan for what is. It plans for what could be forced upon it later. And once a symbol enters public consciousness, removing it becomes costly. So containment must happen early. Quietly, before the audience invests emotionally. That's why the smile mattered. It wasn't harmless. It was strategic warmth. And warmth, in political systems, lowers defenses. Which is why the alleged response was cool, measured, unmoved, but not inactive. Behind the scenes, analysts suggest something else happened. A reassertion of lines. Not public lines. Institutional ones. Conversations about scope. About access. About what is and is not conceivable. These conversations don't leak. They don't need to. Their effects are visible in what doesn't happen next. And what didn't happen next is telling. No escalation. No follow-up narratives. No momentum. The story didn't grow. It plateaued. And plateaus are death for strategy. Because strategies need progression. They need chapters. They need escalation. Without that, they fade. Which suggests that the alleged plan met resistance. Not in the form of rejection, but in the form of irrelevance. And irrelevance is brutal. Because you can fight rejection. You can spin it. You can frame it as persecution. But irrelevance? Irrelevance offers no foothold. Now consider how this must have looked from the outside. A smile that didn't open doors. A posture that didn't move structures. A narrative that didn't advance. This is where analysts believe the realization set in. That the institution had already adjusted. Quietly. Without acknowledgement. And that adjustment closed options. But here's the part no one talks about. This wasn't just about one person. It was about precedent. Because if ambiguity were allowed here, it could be demanded elsewhere. And the monarchy cannot function on negotiated relevance. It functions on defined lanes. That's why Prince William's role is critical. He doesn't just guard the present. He guards the future's constraints. And constraints are what preserve continuity. So the alleged strategy behind the smile didn't fail because it was obvious. It failed because it underestimated institutional patience. It assumed reaction. It got absorption. And absorption neutralizes momentum. But the story doesn't end here. Because once a strategy encounters resistance, it evolves. It searches for alternate paths. And those paths often involve intermediaries. Media. Public voices. Sympathetic framing. Which raises the next question. If direct repositioning stalled, what came next? Because the next phase didn't involve the palace directly. It involved the narrative ecosystem surrounding it. And that ecosystem is far messier, far louder, far harder to control. And it's there, inside that noise, that the next move allegedly surfaced. A move that tested not just the palace, but public patience. And once that happened, the stakes shifted, because the battlefield moved from whispers to perception. And perception is where institutions must act with absolute precision. That's where our story goes next. Because once the alleged strategy behind the smile stalled, the plan didn't stop. It adapted. And the adaptation would force Prince William to respond in a way no one expected. Not by closing doors, but by redefining the room. And that, according to observers, is when everything escalated. What if no one ever said the word? Yet everyone somehow heard it anyway. Because that's how the most persistent royal narratives work. They're never announced. They're never claimed. They're never written down in black and white. They're implied. And implication is far more powerful than declaration. Ask yourself this. How does an idea survive years of denial, distance, and contradiction, yet still resurface again and again in public imagination? Not because it's accurate, but because it's emotionally efficient. This is where the so-called queen narrative comes in. Not a literal crown, not a formal demand, but a symbolic assent. A story that suggests destiny without stating it. And that's why it refuses to die, because it doesn't live in facts. It lives in projection. Now pause. Think about how audiences consume power stories. They don't track constitutional mechanics. They don't read protocols. They read emotion. They read archetypes. And the most irresistible archetype of all is the outsider who returns, not to beg, but to rise. That archetype doesn't require accuracy. It requires contrast. Villain to victim. Victim to visionary. Visionary to inevitability. This is the psychological ladder. And according to royal analysts, once that ladder appears, even faintly, it becomes dangerous. Because people don't climb ladders rationally. They climb them emotionally. That's why the queen narrative never needs to be stated. It only needs to be felt. Now let's be very clear. No serious observer believes there is a legitimate path to the throne here. That's not the point. The point is symbolic hierarchy. Influence, visibility, proximity to power. And symbolic hierarchy can be just as destabilizing as real authority. Because symbols rewrite expectations. Expectations rewrite pressure. And pressure rewrites behavior. This is why the monarchy treats narrative gravity as seriously as legal authority. Gravity pulls whether you acknowledge it or not. So when analysts say that queen narrative alarmed the palace, they're not suggesting paranoia. They're describing pattern recognition. Because history has shown that when the public begins imagining parallel authority, institutions suffer. Now think about why this narrative reappears specifically around moments of transition. Transitions invite speculation. Speculation invites myth-making. And myth-making thrives in uncertainty. Prince William's increasing visibility as the future king creates exactly that uncertainty. Not because of weakness, but because of focus. Every step forward sharpens contrast. And contrast invites counter-narratives. So when whispers of return merged with stories of reinvention, empowerment, and long-term positioning, the subtext became unavoidable. Not queen as title, but queen as metaphor. A figure who commands attention, shapes conversation, occupies symbolic space. That's what unsettles institutions. Because institutions can defeat opposition, they struggle against metaphor. Now consider the contradiction at the heart of this narrative. It positions itself as modern, progressive, breaking tradition, yet it relies entirely on traditional hierarchy to matter. Without the monarchy, the narrative loses altitude. Without proximity to the crown, there is no ascent to imagine. So the story both rejects and requires the institution. That contradiction is the tell. And Prince William would have seen it instantly. Because he's been trained to spot narratives that depend on the system they claim to transcend. Those narratives don't want reform. They want access. And access is the one thing the monarchy protects most fiercely. Now let's talk about why this narrative resonates publicly. Because that's key. It resonates because it simplifies complexity into emotion. Instead of rules, it offers storyline. Instead of duty, it offers destiny. And destiny is seductive, especially to audiences fatigued by protocol and permanence. But here's the part people miss. The monarchy doesn't compete on excitement. It competes on inevitability. It doesn't need to be loved in every moment. It needs to be stable, which is why emotional narratives, no matter how compelling, are ultimately secondary. And Prince William's role is to ensure that hierarchy never appears negotiable. Because once hierarchy looks flexible, it becomes contestable. And once it becomes contestable, it becomes political. That's the nightmare scenario. Now think about how this alleged narrative manifested. Not through speeches. Not through demands. But through association. Language choices. Framing. Positioning. Moments where public discourse blurred lines between relevance and authority. Between attention and influence. That blur is intentional. Because blurred lines invite interpretation. And interpretation gives audiences agency. They decide what something means. And once the audience decides, reversing it becomes costly. This is where the palace's response becomes fascinating. Because instead of countering the narrative, it ignored the metaphor entirely. It refused to engage. Why? Because engaging validates. Silence, when paired with structural clarity, invalidates. So while some commentators expected outrage or denial, the institution chose something colder. Indifference reinforced by demonstration. Demonstration of continuity. Demonstration of order. Demonstration of succession as fact, not discussion. That's how you collapse metaphor. You replace it with reality. But here's where the story deepens. The Queen narrative doesn't survive on palace response. It survives on media amplification. And media thrives on ambiguity. Because ambiguity drives clicks. Questions outperform answers. Speculation outperforms certainty. So even as the palace shut down structural openings, the narrative continued to echo. Not because it was advancing, but because it was unresolved. Unresolved stories linger. They haunt. They resurface. And that's why analysts say the narrative won't die. Because it isn't trying to win. It's trying to persist. Persistence keeps relevance alive. And relevance keeps options open. This is the long game. Now ask yourself this. If you can't advance formally, wouldn't you try to exist symbolically? That's where the alleged strategy shifted next. From access to influence. From return to resonance. From doors to audience. And that's where things became trickier for Prince William. Because influence outside the institution is harder to manage than ambition inside it. You can deny a role. You can't deny attention. And attention, when weaponized, can create pressure without permission. That's why the next phase of this story isn't about palaces. It's about perception. And perception lives in media, not marble halls. Royal analysts point out that this is where the monarchy historically struggles, because it operates on timescales far longer than news cycles. And news cycles reward immediacy, emotion, conflict. So when the Queen narrative began circulating, not officially, but emotionally, it forced a strategic dilemma. Respond and amplify. Ignore and allow speculation. There is no perfect move, only the least damaging one. And that's where Prince William's temperament becomes decisive. He doesn't chase narratives. He outweights them, because time is his ally. But waiting doesn't mean doing nothing. It means strengthening foundations so that narratives collapse under their own weight. And that's exactly what analysts believe he did next. Instead of confronting the metaphor, he reinforced the latter. He clarified succession. Visibility of defined roles increased. Public focus was gently redirected, not aggressively, organically, because organic shifts feel natural, and natural shifts are accepted without resistance. Now here's the irony. The more the Queen narrative tried to exist, the more it highlighted its own impossibility, because the institution never reacted, and lack of reaction removes stakes. Without stakes, narratives lose urgency. They become background noise, and background noise doesn't move systems. It just hums. But there's another layer here. The narrative also served a secondary purpose. It unified opposition. Critics rallied around it. Supporters amplified it. And amplification, even when critical, extends lifespan. This is the paradox of attention. Every reaction feeds the story. So Prince William's restraint wasn't weakness. It was strategy. He refused to supply fuel. And eventually, the fire struggled to burn. But struggling fires don't disappear. They smolder. And smoldering stories can reignite if conditions change. Which brings us to the next turning point. Because after the Queen narrative failed to advance structurally, something shifted again. The focus moved away from ascension toward disruption. If you can't rise above the system, you challenge it indirectly. Through questions, through doubt, through pressure. And that's when the stakes escalated. Because now the narrative wasn't about who might rise. It was about who might lose control. And control is the monarchy's red line. That's when Prince William's posture reportedly changed. Not publicly, but tactically. Because challenging legitimacy, even symbolically, cannot be allowed to metastasize. And that required a different response. Not symbolic. Procedural. Quiet. Decisive. But before we get there, we need to understand one thing. Why this narrative, despite its flaws, kept resurfacing. And the answer is simple. It wasn't about the crown. It was about relevance in a system that defines relevance strictly. And when relevance is denied, it's often reimagined. That's the human impulse. But institutions don't negotiate with impulse. They neutralize it. And that neutralization began long before anyone noticed. Which brings us to the next chapter. Because once the Queen narrative revealed its limits, the strategy pivoted again. From aspiration to pressure. From symbolism to consequence. And that's where Prince William's response moved from passive containment to active prevention. And when that happened, the entire chessboard shifted. Because what came next wasn't about imagination. It was about lines. And once lines are drawn, there's no pretending they don't exist. But how were those lines drawn? And who helped draw them? That answer takes us directly into the private reaction that no one saw, but everyone felt afterward. And once you understand that reaction, you'll see why this story entered a new phase entirely. What happens when the future king doesn't react at all? No statement, no denial, no visible irritation. Just nothing. Because if you were expecting a flash of temper or a public rebuke, this chapter is where expectations collapse. The private reaction, according to those who track palace behavior rather than headlines, was not loud. It was meticulous, and that's what made it so unsettling. Ask yourself a question. When a person trained for decades to protect an institution notices a growing ambiguity around power, do they confront the source? Or do they reinforce the system so thoroughly that the ambiguity has nowhere left to exist? That distinction matters, because one approach escalates conflict, the other dissolves it, and dissolution leaves no fingerprints. This is where observers say Prince William showed his hand, not in public, but in pattern. The first sign wasn't a speech. It was pacing. Suddenly, the tempo of royal visibility changed. Not dramatically, subtly. Appearances that emphasized continuity. Moments that reinforced hierarchy. Imagery that centered stability. None of it framed as response. All of it framed as normal. Normality is the most powerful narrative in any institution. Because normality makes alternatives feel disruptive without naming them. Now think about the alleged situation from William's perspective. He isn't responding to a single rumor. He's responding to a trajectory that begins with whispers, moves through reframing, and lands in symbolic challenge, not overt challenge. The dangerous kind, the kind that says, things could be different. And once could enters the public imagination, it has to be managed, not denied, managed. That's why the private reaction wasn't emotional. Emotion narrows options. Strategy expands them. So what did strategy look like here? According to analysts, it looked like consolidation. Consolidation of roles. Consolidation of messaging. Consolidation of internal alignment. When institutions sense ambiguity, they close ranks, not publicly, but procedurally. Meetings happen. Briefings sharpen. Boundaries are clarified. None of this leaks. Leaks are for drama. This was for control. One royal watcher put it bluntly, when the palace goes quiet, it's usually because it's working. Silence isn't absence. It's preparation. And preparation is invisible until it's complete. Now let's address the misconception. Many people assume William's restraint means avoidance. It doesn't. It means confidence. He doesn't need to fight narratives because his position isn't up for debate. His job is to ensure that no competing narrative gains enough traction to force debate in the first place. That's the difference between authority and popularity. Popularity argues. Authority waits. And waiting, in this case, allowed something crucial to happen. The narrative began to reveal its limits. Without opposition, it lacked friction. Without friction, it lacked drama. Without drama, it lost oxygen. This is counterintuitive, but true. Stories need conflict to survive. By refusing to play the villain, the palace removed the story's engine. But that alone isn't enough. Because silence without structure can be interpreted as weakness. So structure had to be visible. And it was. Observers noticed a renewed emphasis on the line of succession. Not as a reaction, as a reminder. A reminder that this isn't a popularity contest. It's a constitutional reality. Reality beats speculation every time, if it's presented calmly. Now let's talk about what didn't happen. No back-channel briefings attacking motives. No character critiques. No personal framing. That absence is deliberate. Personalizing a narrative elevates it. William understands this. He learned it watching others make the opposite mistake. So instead of framing the situation as a challenge from an individual, the palace framed it as business as usual. Business as usual is lethal to disruption, because disruption needs acknowledgement to exist. Now here's where the private reaction becomes more complex. Because containment alone wasn't enough. Containment prevents spread. But prevention requires foresight, and foresight requires anticipating the next move. What happens when a symbolic strategy stalls? It looks for leverage elsewhere. Media, public sympathy, external pressure. That's when institutions must draw lines, not publicly, but internally. According to analysts, those lines were drawn quietly, not in dramatic declarations. In scope, what is conceivable? What is not? Scope is everything. Because once scope is defined, options collapse. And collapsing options doesn't look like rejection. It looks like inevitability. Now imagine being on the other side of that. You don't receive a letter saying no. You simply discover that pathways you assumed existed don't. Doors don't slam. They're just not there. That's how institutional power operates at its highest level. It doesn't argue with ambition. It outlasts it. And this is why the private reaction matters more than any public response ever could. Because public responses are reactive, private reactions shape reality. Royal historians often note that the most consequential decisions are the ones no one remembers happening, because nothing dramatic occurred. Life just continued, on slightly altered terms. That's what observers suggest happened here. A recalibration, so subtle that even seasoned watchers debated whether anything had changed at all. But change doesn't need spectacle to be real. It needs alignment. And alignment is what William secured. Now let's address another contradiction. If this response was so effective, why does the story continue? Because narratives don't die instantly. They echo. They linger. They get repeated by people who don't track outcomes. And repetition can create the illusion of momentum. But illusion isn't movement. It's noise. And noise, without access, goes nowhere. That's the key. Access didn't expand. It contracted. And contraction is the clearest signal of institutional decision. Now ask yourself this. If a plan depends on gradual normalization, what happens when normalization is quietly blocked? It can't escalate. Escalation exposes intent. And exposed intent invites direct refusal. So the plan stalls. That's what analysts believe occurred here. Not because of confrontation, because of absence. Absence of opportunity. Absence of engagement. Absence of oxygen. And that absence wasn't accidental. It was designed. Now here's the twist most people miss. This wasn't just about protecting William's future. It was about protecting the monarchy from precedent. Because once one symbolic return is normalized, others can demand similar treatment. And institutions cannot function on exceptions. Exceptions become bargaining chips. So the private reaction wasn't personal. It was structural. And structural responses are non-negotiable. Which brings us to a critical moment. A moment when analysts say William's posture shifted from observation to assurance. Not assurance to the public, assurance to the system. That everything was contained. That no escalation was required. That continuity remained intact. That's when the palace's tone settled. Not tense, resolved. And resolution has a visible effect. Speculation loses urgency. Media attention drifts. Audiences move on. Because unresolved stories only persist when there's hope of revelation. When hope disappears, so does interest. And that's exactly what seemed to happen. The narrative didn't explode. It evaporated. But evaporation doesn't mean disappearance. It means transformation. And transformed narratives don't target the same space. They move. Which leads us to the next development. Because once the private reaction closed internal pathways, the pressure shifted outward. From access to optics. From structure to sympathy. From palace to public. And that's where things became louder. Because public arenas reward noise. And noise is harder to ignore. That's the next challenge William faced. Not a whisper inside the palace, but echoes outside it. And echoes don't care about protocol. They care about attention. Which means the next phase of this story didn't test William's patience. It tested his adaptability. Because the battlefield changed. And when the battlefield changes, even the calmest strategist must adjust. But adjust doesn't mean panic. It means reposition. And repositioning, in this case, would be subtle, but decisive. Because what came next wasn't about denying relevance. It was about redefining it, on terms that couldn't be misinterpreted. And that's where the palace chessboard shifted again. But to understand that shift, we have to leave the private corridors and step into the wider ecosystem. Because once narratives escape institutions, they enter a space where logic doesn't always win. Emotion does. And emotion is unpredictable. That unpredictability forced a new kind of response. Not louder, smarter. And that response would quietly reshape the next phase of this story. Because when public sympathy becomes the tool, institutions must change the game entirely. And the move that followed would do exactly that. But it happened so quietly that most people didn't notice until it was over. And by then, the options had already disappeared. That's where we're headed next. What if the real battle was never about returning at all, but about who controlled the board? Because once the echoes escaped the palace walls, everything changed. The environment shifted from corridors to cameras, from procedure to perception, from silence to noise. And noise is dangerous, not because it's powerful, but because it's contagious. Ask yourself this. When a narrative no longer needs access to survive, how do institutions contain it? They can't close doors that aren't being knocked on. They can't deny roles that aren't being requested. So they do something else. They rearrange the board. This is where the palace chessboard comes into focus. Not a literal room, a strategic ecosystem. An ecosystem where every move affects 5 others, where visibility equals weight, and where timing matters more than intention. According to analysts, once the narrative shifted outward toward public sympathy and media resonance, the palace response entered a new phase, not defensive, configurational, because configuration determines outcomes long before conflict appears. Now think about chess for a moment. You don't attack every piece. You control the center. You limit mobility. You force your opponent to play within narrowing options. That's what observers believe happened here. The palace didn't challenge the narrative. It made it irrelevant by controlling the environment it needed to grow. The first adjustment was subtle. Attention. Attention is currency, and the palace redirected it, not away from controversy, but toward continuity. More emphasis on institutional rhythm, more visibility of duty, more reinforcement of the existing order, not as reaction, as baseline. Baseline narratives are devastating because they make alternatives look like distractions. Now consider how this affects public perception. When stability is constantly visible, speculative stories feel speculative. They lack contrast. They fade into background chatter. That's the first layer of board control. But the second layer is even more important. Coordination. Royal ecosystems don't function through individuals alone. They function through alignment. When alignment tightens, narratives lose entry points. Analysts suggest this alignment happened quietly. Messaging became consistent. Appearances synchronized. Themes unified. Not loud. Seamless. And seamlessness communicates confidence. Confidence tells the public there's nothing to worry about. And when the public feels calm, speculative narratives struggle. But here's the contradiction. The louder the external noise became, the calmer the internal posture remained. That contrast matters, because panic legitimizes pressure. Calm absorbs it. This is where the chessboard metaphor becomes literal. The palace didn't move pieces aggressively. It limited space. Space is where narratives maneuver. Without space, stories collide with reality and collapse. Now let's talk about the players. In any ecosystem, there are visible figures and invisible ones. The visible figures draw attention. The invisible ones manage flow. According to royal watchers, it was the invisible layer that did most of the work here. Advisors, schedulers, communications architects. They didn't issue statements. They adjusted environments. Which events get attention? Which themes get oxygen? Which conversations are amplified? This isn't censorship. It's prioritization. And prioritization defines what feels important. Now ask yourself, if a narrative depends on the idea that it's being unfairly excluded, what happens when exclusion isn't visible? What happens when no one acknowledges the claim? It becomes difficult to sustain. Victimhood narratives need an antagonist. Without one, they wobble. And wobbling stories don't travel far. This is why the palace chessboard is so effective. It removes the opponent's mirror. There's no reflection, no resistance to react against. Just an institution moving forward as if nothing is happening. That's infuriating for strategists, because they can't escalate without revealing intent. And revealing intent invites scrutiny. Now consider Prince William's position again. He doesn't need to win an argument. He needs to maintain a trajectory. And trajectories don't change because of noise. They change because of force. And force, in institutional terms, is legitimacy. Legitimacy isn't declared. It's demonstrated over time. That's why the chessboard response focused on repetition. Duty repeated. Hierarchy repeated. Continuity repeated. Repetition dulls novelty. And novelty is what speculative narratives feed on. But here's where the board gets more complex. Because there are external players too. Media outlets, commentators, public figures. They're not controlled by the palace. They respond to incentives. And incentives reward drama. So the palace can't silence noise. It can only make it less profitable. How? By depriving it of escalation. Stories that don't develop lose value. Stories that don't provoke reaction stall. And stalled stories don't trend. This is why the palace response was patient. Patience starves drama. Now let's address a critical misunderstanding. Some interpret this approach as passive. It isn't. It's active restraint. And restraint is one of the hardest strategies to execute because it requires confidence that time is on your side. And time is always on the side of institutions that don't depend on popularity. That's the monarchy's advantage. It doesn't need to be believed every day. It needs to be there tomorrow, and the day after. Now here's where the chessboard tightened. Analysts point to a moment when the palace didn't just manage perception, it clarified boundaries. Not publicly. Internally. Boundaries define what can happen next. They don't announce themselves. They manifest as absence. Absence of opportunity. Absence of access. Absence of ambiguity. That absence is powerful because it doesn't provoke backlash. It simply exists. And once it exists, strategies must adapt. Now imagine being on the outside of that. You don't receive a rejection. You receive nothing. And nothing is difficult to argue with. You can fight opposition. You can't fight inevitability. This is why the chessboard metaphor is so apt. The palace didn't checkmate. It constrained. It forced moves into less effective lanes. And less effective lanes lead to fatigue. Fatigue leads to abandonment. That's how strategies end. Not with defeat. With disinterest. But here's the twist. While the palace was consolidating internally, the external narrative didn't vanish. It transformed. When access is blocked, narratives shift to influence. When influence is blocked, they shift to pressure. Pressure is louder, messier, harder to ignore. And that's where the next phase began. Because pressure doesn't need permission. It just needs attention. And attention, in the public sphere, is easier to capture. This is where the chessboard expanded beyond the palace. Into media ecosystems, social conversations, public sympathy cycles. And that expansion forced a recalibration. Because while institutions excel at patience, public arenas reward immediacy. That mismatch creates vulnerability. So the palace had to do something counterintuitive. It had to be visible without being reactive, present without being defensive. That balance is rare. And that's where Prince William's approach became even more critical. He didn't chase the conversation. He elevated the baseline. Elevating the baseline changes the reference point. When the baseline is stability, disruption looks irresponsible. That's a powerful reframing. Now think about the emotional beats. Public sympathy can be persuasive. It can pressure institutions into appearing compassionate. But compassion without clarity creates chaos. And chaos erodes trust. So the palace response emphasized clarity with warmth. Duty framed as service. Structure framed as reassurance. Not cold. Grounded. This matters because audiences are drawn to certainty in uncertain times. And certainty outcompetes drama when fatigue sets in. Fatigue always sets in. That's another institutional advantage. The palace can wait out cycles. Narratives can't. They require constant fuel. Now here's the part that changes everything. At a certain point, analysts believe the palace recognized that the narrative wasn't trying to enter the system anymore. It was trying to question it. Question legitimacy. Question authority. Question future direction. That's when containment becomes prevention. Because questioning legitimacy, even subtly, cannot be allowed to gain traction. And prevention requires drawing lines. Not with statements. With structure. And that structure was reinforced decisively. Visibility of succession increased. Public roles were clarified. Focus shifted forward, not backward. Forward-looking narratives are lethal to revisionist stories because they deny relevance to the past. This is where the chessboard closed. The center was controlled. The lanes narrowed. And the remaining moves led nowhere productive. But here's the thing about constrained strategies. They don't stop immediately. They lash out. They seek attention through escalation. And escalation, when it happens, reveals intent. That's the moment institutions prepare for. Because revealed intent justifies firm response. And firm response can then be framed as necessary, not personal. This is why Prince William's restraint mattered. He waited until the board was set. Until the contrast was clear. Until escalation, if it came, would look unreasonable. And that's exactly where the story was headed. Because pressure doesn't dissipate quietly. It spikes. And when it spikes, institutions act. The next move wouldn't be subtle. It wouldn't be symbolic. It would be procedural. And procedural moves don't generate headlines, but they change reality. So the chessboard phase set the conditions. Conditions for a decisive shift. Not a confrontation, a closure. But closures don't announce themselves. They manifest as facts. And once facts replace speculation, narratives lose power. That moment was approaching, and when it arrived, it would feel sudden, even though it had been building all along. Because that's how strategic patience works. It feels invisible until it's finished. And when it's finished, there's nothing left to argue about. That's where we're going next. Because the next chapter isn't about strategy. It's about consequence. What happens when public sympathy meets institutional boundaries? And who backs down when those two collide? That collision would reveal more than any whisper ever could. What happens when feelings surge and memory refuses to budge? Because this is where the story tightens. Not around palaces or power plays, but around something far more volatile. Public sympathy. Sympathy is fast. It's emotional. It's contagious.